Well, hello and welcome to another edition of Health Solutions with Shawn and Janet Needham, where Team Needham discusses everything healthcare. I am your host, Shawn Needham, and I am streaming live from South Dakota, Rapid City. I love it out here, and believe it or not, it is like 50 degrees warmer than where I'm at in Washington, so I'm excited about that. I know my wife is from North Dakota, and she always complains about how cold it is back here. But yeah, 58 degrees actually yesterday, so I'm super excited about that. But what I'm most excited about today is we have Robb Wolf on our podcast today, and I'm so excited to interview him. I've been following him on social media for a while now, and he is an expert in nutrition, and he's written a few books. Wired to Eat is the one I was first introduced to, and I'll be letting him talk about that book. And I don't know if I'm talking out of turn, but I believe he's kind of the one, at least in my opinion, and for my life specifically, that kind of introduced the paleo diet and made it popular. And I'll let him talk about that also. But the most important part is he is a brown belt in jiu-jitsu, so don't mess with Robb Wolf. And Robb, he has a great radio show too, called Healthy Rebellion. So you'll have to check that out also. And Robb, without further ado, thank you for being on our podcast. I really appreciate it. And introduce yourself.
Oh, thank you. The most important part is I have 2 daughters and a wife. That is the most important part. But thanks for having me.
Yeah, that is the most important.
A little bit of my background. I was, by training, I had an undergrad in biochemistry and was looking at potentially medical school, potentially an MD, PhD program. I was doing bench level research in cancer and autoimmunity at the Fred Hutch Cancer Research Center, and developed ulcerative colitis so bad that I nearly died from it. And this was 23 years ago. The symptoms and kind of the development happened progressively over a couple of years. At the time I was tinkering with a high carb, low fat, vegan diet. And for some people that may work wonderfully. For me, it was an absolutely catastrophic disaster that nearly killed me. And it was interesting, the process of kind of figuring out what was going wrong with me at that time. And that's a whole kind of long, somewhat interesting story in and of itself, but that's where this idea of ancestral eating, of a paleo type diet, got on my radar, because the foods that I was reacting to are what we might typically call Neolithic foods: grains, legumes, to some degree dairy. And I was kind of left wondering, well, if I react to all these things, what on earth does one eat if you do not eat those things? And it was kind of a train of consciousness flow. And I thought about, again, this was 1998 when this all happened. And somewhere along the line, I had heard the term Paleolithic diet, like this idea that, maybe there were some laudable characteristics to the health of our hunter-gatherer forebears, based in part potentially on the types and amounts of foods that they ate. So I did some research on that. There wasn't much that existed at that point, but I found some material from 2 main people: Lauren Cordain, who's kind of credited with really the initial popularization of the paleo diet concept. He released the book, The Paleo Diet, back in 2001. And then another person, Arthur Devaney, who's a professor emeritus of economics from UC Irvine. And that was really about all the information that was available. There was a little bit here and there and some anthropology, websites and whatnot, but really not much. But I was convinced enough, and I was sick enough at that time that, what do I really have to lose by changing my eating in this way? And so I did, and it put my ulcerative colitis into remission. And it was such an interesting process, because this was the beginning of my understanding of kind of evolutionary biology as it applies to health, and thinking about sleep and food, circadian biology being this huge piece to this whole story, the gut microbiome. And it was impactful enough that I didn't really want to go to medical school. When I looked at what I was facing, 4 more years of standard medical school and then a residency and all the rest of that, just to then come out the back end of it and practice medicine, if I wanted to practice it the way that I wanted to, would be, largely at odds with what all of my training, which is mainly trying to prevent people from dying in like an acute care setting. So I wasn't entirely sure what I was going to do, but about a year and a half went by, and I was still poking around on the interwebs, and I found this kind of weird workout called CrossFit. And my friend Dave Warner, who's a retired Navy SEAL, he and I started doing this workout in his garage of all places. And maybe 3-4 months went by, and we had about 15 people that we had roped into working out with us. And we reached out to Greg and Lauren Glassman, the founders of CrossFit. And we said, hey, we want to open a gym. We want to call it CrossFit. Can we do that? And they said, yes, go be achieve. There was no contract. It was very Wild West, handshake type deal there, getting that all started. But that was arguably a large part of the reason why I kind of had the trajectory that I did, and the paleo diet definitely grew and died in lockstep with the CrossFit concept. It was really an interesting vehicle for helping to expose people to this idea of ancestral eating and a paleo type diet. And again, dovetailing in all these other features of like sleep and circadian biology, gut health. I would say, even though I'm kind of known as the food guy, I 50% or more of the time that I spend, whether I'm traveling or lecturing or whatnot, is talking about circadian biology, photoperiod, and to some degree the gut microbiome also. So the food part is important, but it's really this kind of holistic view, pulling everything together, which is what I've taken out of all this evolutionary biology experience, and that is a very long-winded explanation for kind of my genesis story.
Yeah, well, that's a great story. And by the way, that would be the phototherapy, circadian rhythm, and gut microbiome would be great topics for another podcast.
Sure.
Alone, So tell us a little bit about, for those of us that don't know, tell us a little bit about, in simple terms, what is the paleo diet?
By exclusion, which is maybe the easier way to tackle it, it's a way of eating that generally doesn't include or make the base of the diet around grains, legumes, and dairy. And that's honestly the easiest way to explain it. But the inclusive way, it's a way of eating that is focused on lean meat, seafood, fruits, vegetables, roots, shoots, tubers. It's pretty agnostic as to macronutrient ratios. Like there are some cultures that eat a very high carb iteration of the paleo diet. There are some cultures that eat a very low carb iteration of the paleo diet. But the commonality there, again, is more akin to what they don't eat. And they're definitely not eating highly processed, hyperpalatable foods. Like that is one thing that I think is a consistency there, and also something that the paleo diet has in common with most traditional food methodologies, like the Mediterranean diet, or different types of like South American cuisine, Central American cuisine, which have served those populations well for hundreds or thousands of years, and have allowed people to be quite healthy and robust and live at free of the modern chronic degenerative diseases. Type 2 diabetes, cardiovascular disease, or largely free of those, especially compared to what the modern versions of that are.
So basically, no grains, no legumes. Is that right?
Generally, and again, this is when it's like no, then people freak out, and and then somebody will say, well, cashews are technically a legume, and it's like, oh, okay, you got me, But it's the thing is that most people are so divorced from anything that we would consider to be reasonable eating that we have to provide some lane lines. When you take a kid bowling for the first time, these bumpers come up that keep them 100% out of the gutter, and they throw the ball, and it doesn't matter if it bounces back and forth 5 times, it goes down the lane and it knocks down some pins, and the kid has a sense of success. And then over time, as they get better and better, then we drop the bumpers, and they have to figure out how to stay out of the gutter on their own. And to some degree, that's the way I view virtually all, diets, is that somebody somewhere is trying to set up some lane lines to just give people somewhere to start, because there's so many different opinions and ways to tackle all this, that if you just throw everything at folks and they're overwhelmed and they don't do anything. So yeah, I mean, in general, a paleo type diet is, quote, no grains, no legumes, no dairy, but it really needs to be viewed not as religious doctrine, but just as, hey, maybe you have some health or body composition, concerns that you want to address. Here's a simple set of guidelines to get you going. Don't overanalyze it. Don't read into it too much. Like, let's do this for 30 days, reassess, and then we'll get more sophisticated and more refined as we go along.
That makes sense. And that clears up, I mean, some of the confusion, because I think, traditionally when we think paleo, we're like, okay, well, what did our ancestors eat? And, for thousands of years, we've had herding animals, right? So we've drank dairy either from cows or goats for thousands of years. Is that correct?
Yeah.
So,
and I mean, yeah. And it's an interesting point there, where we have some populations that have developed the lactase persistence gene. So all humans express lactase as babies, because we're hopefully being able to consume breast milk.
Right.
And so lactose is this disaccharide that, if you don't have a specific enzyme to break it down, it gives you a lot of gas and a lot of bloating. It's very, very uncomfortable. Some people around the world, in Northern European, African, and Asian populations, developed different iterations of maintaining lactase throughout life or later in life. But there are quite a number of populations that don't have the lactase persistence gene, but do consume dairy as part of their traditional eating. But it's because they develop things like yogurt and kefir and hard cheeses, which remove the lactose out of the dairy. And so our technology and our culture have allowed us to exploit these foods that historically might have been problematic in other situations. So it's not just our genetics and it's not just our epigenetics, but it's also our technology and culture that have modified things in ways that may make a food available to us. Yeah. But I will say there's still a lot of people, especially in modern times, with leaky gut and whatnot, that experience a lot of systemic inflammatory issues from dairy. Like, it's one of those, dairy and eggs are two of those suspicious foods. Like, if people are having like joint issues or kind of like foggy headedness after meals, those are things that I like to pull out in a 30-day reset, because they are common immunogenic problems for a lot of people.
And that it's just kind of an elimination. You're just eliminating things that might be problematic. Elimination diet, essentially, right?
Yeah. Pull them out, reintroduce, see how folks do. Yeah.
So tell me a little bit about, so paleo is not necessarily low carb. You're talking about fruits, right?
Well, it could be quite high carb, like the Catawbans of the South Pacific eat about a 70 to 80% carbohydrate diet, and it's considered paleo. They're actually one of the better studied groups of folks. Stefan Lindeberg, before he died, he did a really amazing series of studies where he had some epidemiological studies looking at the Catawbans versus a Nordic Swedish population. And he postulated that certain immunogenic compounds in Neolithic foods, these things called lectins, might be a problem for folks. And then he went through and developed a series of studies that went from an epidemiological study to an animal model to a human intervention. And it really was quite convincing, but this was not a low carb group of folks at all. And some people will say, well, the Catawbans have been eating that way for several hundred, possibly several thousand years, and maybe there's some genetic adaptations to that. That's a possibility, but I'm of the opinion that humans should be able to handle a really broad diet almost regardless of what their genetic background is. There is a little variability on that, but it's more our modern world. I think some of the side effects of overuse of antibiotics can be problematic. some gut issues, which the antibiotics can play into that. But I think that those end up being factors that end up limiting us or making it challenging for folks like me. Like I don't do spectacularly well on a high carb diet. I will range somewhere between like 50 and 100 grams of carbs a day. My more active days, I can eat at the higher end of that. And if I eat much above that, I just don't feel well. My A1Cs start going up. So I clearly end up with kind of poor blood sugar control. But yeah, I mean, the paleo diet is it's quality oriented, not macronutrient oriented. Whereas if we talk about like a ketogenic diet, interestingly, the quality becomes not that important, at least for some people in ketogenic diet space. But the macronutrient ratios, the amount of protein, carbs, fat become really, really important. And clearly one could eat a paleo type diet built around ketogenic macros, and that would be perfectly fine. And that's kind of what I do, aside from a little bit more carbs on hard training days than normal. So, folks oftentimes ask a little bit about, or a common question, I guess, is a good way to frame this. What's the difference between keto and paleo? And I mentioned a little bit about that earlier. Paleo really, in my mind, is focused on food quality. And if it really brings something powerful to the conversation, it asks some questions around immunogenic properties of foods. Like some people really don't do well with tomatoes, potatoes, eggplants. They're in the nightshade family, which there are fairly toxic constituents in some of those plants. Some people do fine with them, other people don't. Gluten is another example. Not everybody is gluten intolerant or has celiac. For the people that have problems with that, it's really a huge deal. So paleo kind of shines a light on appropriate protein, adequate protein, appropriate glycemic load, which again will be a little bit dependent on genetics and epigenetics and activity level and whatnot. And then kind of the cherry on the sundae is the consideration of immunogenic foods, and that can vary from person to person. Unfortunately, like I'm highly reactive to eggs now, and I think that's because I over consumed eggs in the past, but they are also kind of evolutionarily kind of a novel food. Like people in the past would not have had just acres of chickens that we can harvest eggs from and eat a 6-egg omelet, every day for years. So I think that would have been much more of a transient kind of thing. But the paleo diet is definitely oriented towards food quality. And then the ketogenic diet is primarily concerned about macronutrient ratios. And we have like the traditional epilepsy type ketogenic diet, which is quite low protein, very, very low carb, and high fat, like upwards of 80% fat, which doesn't leave much for other macronutrients. Clearly there's only, 20-25% left if you're at a 75-80% fat diet to, divide up between protein and carbs. But that diet was developed 101 years ago for epilepsy, for a condition that, before the development of anti-epileptic drugs, there really was no good treatment for epilepsy. And interestingly, the ketogenic diet has long been superior generally to the drugs that are available. It's just a much more challenging thing to do that intervention. But this epilepsy-based ketogenic diet, medical ketogenic diet, is a very high-fat, low protein, very low carb diet. And then we have things like Atkins and modified Atkins, where the protein intake is much higher. Carbohydrate is still restricted, but the fat intake is more moderate, 65%. And what's interesting there is that we find a lot of folks that just need help with weight loss, just need help with some metabolic conditions. They do great on that. And even athletes do pretty well on that, depending on what type of background they have. And again, we could dovetail in the food quality characteristics of a paleo diet, really trying to have high quality, whole real foods. And you could dovetail that with some iteration of a ketogenic diet. I think a medical ketogenic diet is going to be really difficult to pull off in that context, because getting 80% of your calories from fat and not using something like whole whipping cream and butter and whatnot is going to be really hard. Like it's difficult to do, but something like a modified Atkins is quite easy to do with, paleo type foods. And so those are, again, one of the common questions is what's the difference between paleo and keto? And the keto is primarily concerned with the macronutrient ratios, how much protein, carbs, fat, we have there. And then paleo is primarily a consideration of just the food quality. And really the big piece to that, I think, or the big contribution that it's provided, is an awareness that there are some foods that are immunogenic for some people that cause autoimmune issues, gut issues, inflammatory issues.
Well, that makes a lot of sense. And, I know there's a big keto craze right now, and maybe I'm overstating that, but I know one of the things with keto, and I would like your opinion on this, is that, people think, well, if it's keto, they can eat all they want of it, right? So I've seen keto people eat a bag of pork rinds. So can you speak on that?
Yeah, and I've been on both sides of that equation. So, Gary Taubes, who I respect his work a lot, but I think he needs to update his thinking on a lot of things. He was kind of this beacon of hope back around 2000, 2001. He wrote a piece that really was incredibly popular, and it was for the New York Times, The Soft Science of Dietary Fat. And it was a little bit of a history of the Atkins diet, where it came from, and some of the remarkably powerful clinical applications that this low carb diet has. And he began to formulate and put forward this idea that one could not gain weight with a low insulin diet, and basically a low carb or ketogenic diet. And he really brought that whole idea forward in his seminal book, Good Calories, Bad Calories, which is like this 600-page book. It's remarkably well referenced, and it was super compelling. There's some really compelling pieces to the story. And from my personal experience, at least initially eating a low carb diet, I tried to overeat. Like I would just pour olive oil. I would make a salad and I would pour olive oil. I bought olive oil by the gallon jugs, from Costco. And I was very active. I was doing jiu-jitsu, doing some kickboxing, lifting some weights. And I just couldn't. I was leaner than I'd ever been in my life. I mean, just like shredded through the midsection. And I had, prior to that, when I was eating a higher carb diet, I always had that, what I now recognize as kind of insulin resistant fat storage around my midsection and whatnot. So that was just this shocking difference for me. And it was really compelling with Gary's notion that so long as you keep insulin levels down, then you were good to go on like fat gain. And also there's a meme out there that as long as you keep insulin low, that you are 100% scot-free from any type of cardiovascular disease concerns. And unfortunately, I just think that all of that ended up being wrong. I do think that carbohydrate control is incredibly powerful for a host of issues. Just like last week, and Shawn, I'll try to remember to dig up this paper and send it to you. The American Diabetes Association came out with a position paper saying that low carb diets provide a disproportionate leverage in glycemic control in type 2 diabetics. Like it was just holy smokes, 40 years late, but thank God they're finally getting there. And it was kind of unequivocal on the point. So I think low carb diets are shockingly powerful tools, but like any tool, a hammer is a great tool and a saw is a great tool. But if I want a precision cut in a piece of wood, I don't use a hammer. If I want to drive a wedge of metal through a piece of wood, I don't use a saw. So I think, carbohydrate restricted diets are really powerful. And I think having a snack of pork rinds is probably reasonable when one is on a low carb diet. But I think making, for too many people, they start down this path of a low carb diet. maybe have some success initially and then start getting pulled into all the low carb treats and doing things like a stick of butter in their coffee. And then lo and behold, 6 months down the road, they start gaining weight and they start seeing like triglycerides ironically elevating, certainly cholesterol and lipoproteins elevating on this low carb diet. And it's because they figured out a way to overeat on a diet that is arguably very, very satiating and difficult to overeat on. But a stick of butter is like 1,000 calories or 500 calories if you do, when the buttered coffee was all the craze. And I actually recommended that back in 2005 for a while. And then we were doing blood work on our folks. And I saw like 50% of the people that did this, their cholesterol levels just exploded. And I'm like, oh, if you're not a Sherpa living in the Himalayas, humping 100 pounds up a mountain at 20,000 feet elevation, apparently this isn't a good thing. And may not be a good thing even under that circumstance, other than, needing some really concentrated calories. So this was nearly a decade before Dave Asprey, popularized the bulletproof coffee and the butter in the coffee and everything. But people just, the cool thing about the time that we live in is we can have an idea and we can experiment with the idea, and then we can test different parameters. So, and the kind of bugger though is that some people will eat a low carb diet. They feel really good. They do the buttered coffee, and I know I'm kind of going far afield from what your original question was, but their not their triglycerides, but their lipoproteins and cholesterol explode, which I really do think is increasing their cardiovascular disease risk. It's not the same as if they have high blood sugar and high blood pressure and a smoker and, all these other things. But I think it's definitely a concern, but they still feel great. And I think that that's one of the challenging features of some of these low carb diets, is that when somebody's eating themselves into cardiovascular disease on a high carb diet, they kind of feel like shit going there. Like they know that they don't feel good. They have highs and lows in their energy and bad blood sugar crashes and everything. But there are people that and I'm kind of one of these folks, like I would feel great just drinking buttered coffee. Like my cognition is good and I'm firing on all cylinders, but my lipoproteins and cholesterol just go to the moon. And as I have tried to make every deal with the universe that I can, that is like, well, so long as my blood pressure is low and so long as my blood sugar is low, and all of my imaging has been good thus far. But as I've learned more and more about lipidology, I've just come to the conclusion, like, well, I don't need to drink butter in my coffee every day. And if I have some olive oil and some macadamias for some of my fat, so I get some monounsaturated fat instead of just, kind of dairy-based saturated fat, my cholesterol and lipoproteins fall by 50%. Like they just cut in half, and they fall right in the realm that any doctor would be like, yeah, you look great. You're going to die from something, but it's probably not going to be cardiovascular disease. So again, I know that was a long rambling, answer to a short question, but yeah, I think that folks take the cool elements, kind of the liberation of a low carb diet, because you can have some things like pork rinds and maybe some buttered coffee or something sometimes, and in reasonable amounts. That's the thing that gets lost in this, is that amounts still matter. And there was a time when people were completely of the opinion that the amount that you consume didn't matter on a low carb diet. And there are still folks out there that perpetuate that idea. And I do think it's better than overeating a mixed diet, like overeating like pizza and ice cream, high carb and high fat. Yeah, that's going to be a disaster, but it's not a free lunch overeating on a low carb diet either.
Well, so you answered. Thank you for that long answer, because there were some questions that popped up during there that you answered. So I like it, because the cholesterol thing, thank you for clearing that up.
Mm-hmm.
I know there's different pages on cholesterol, and I know there's a lot more to the story with cardiovascular disease than just cholesterol.
Yes.
Yeah. That's what I try to explain to my patients as a pharmacist too.
Yeah.
So is it calories in, calories out for losing weight?
Yes, with the caveat, though, that not all calories have the same metabolic effect, have the same hormonal effect. So it's really well understood that overeating protein, like there have been these fascinating protein overfeeding studies, and folks don't lose weight, but what they do end up losing is fat, and they gain muscle mass even if they're not resistance training. And this is making people eat like 2.5 or 3 grams of protein per pound of body weight, which is just a gag fest amount of protein. Like you have to really like hold people's feet to the fire to even get them to eat that amount of food, which is interesting in and of itself. And this is something that is somewhat universal within nutrition now, is that protein is a highly satiating nutrient. And if we eat adequate protein, we tend to eat less of other items. Interestingly, though, fat, like a scoop of mayonnaise is really, really easy to store. Now, the context, though, is to store on our body as excess calories. So carbohydrates are a little bit more difficult to store because the carbohydrates, although they spike insulin and that facilitates the storage of calories as fat on our body, in our person, the excess calories of carbohydrates have to get converted into fat. And so there's this kind of step there, and there's a little bit of loss of energy in that. And so this is, though, where the combinations of foods, like it's well understood in animal husbandry that if you want to fatten up a pig, for example, you have a decent amount of carbohydrates as well as a decent amount of fat, because the carbohydrate fat combo tastes really good. It tends to stimulate insulin secretion, and that insulin secretion. So if things taste good, you tend to overeat. If we overeat, we've got excess calories. And if our insulin is a little high because we've eaten too many calories and too many carbohydrates, then it's easy to store all of that excess fat and the carbohydrate. So this is again where it gets calories in, calories out. Yes, it's true, but if somebody eats a high protein diet, they will tend to not overeat. So whatever else they eat, whether it's carbs or fat or a carb fat combo, so long as people eat an adequate amount of protein, and my recommendation on that is about 1 gram of protein per pound of lean body mass, up to 1 gram of protein per pound of body weight is kind of the upper and lower bounds on that. So if people eat adequate protein, it's really difficult for them to overeat the other stuff. Like they just tend not to do that. So, calories matter, hormones matter, satiety matters, like all of this stuff matters. And it's frustrating because you will have folks say in the really kind of low carb jihadi camp that they're just like, the only thing that matters is keeping insulin low. And there is science that really shoots holes in that rather powerfully. And you have these folks that I would say are out of the like evidence-based nutrition camps that will, blow some holes in that. But then these evidence-based nutrition folks tend to mainly work with like fitness competitors and figure athletes who are on the best of days tend to have some disordered eating as kind of like a baseline for them, and are either disordered eating or are remarkably disciplined and very, very different. And what we take from the way that they eat, I don't know that it can be applied to any type of a general population. Like these folks will eat chicken breast and Pop-Tarts and look amazing on stage. And I just don't know that that's like, where do you build a public health recommendation around that? Like it's kind of ridiculous. Right. Both of these worlds existing at the same time, and both of them, it's kind of like the blind men who, they're feeling the elephant, and one's got the trunk, and they've got different parts of it. And both of these folks have some insight and have some truth, and they both have huge, in my opinion, glaring holes in the way that they're looking at things. Food quality matters. Satiety of the food that we eat matters. The timing matters. If we're eating the bulk of our calories late in the evening, it seems to have a more negative metabolic effect than if we overate early in the day. So even the timing of our food matters. And that's a whole, if you ever want to do a circadian biology thing at some point, and you being a pharmacist, you could speak to this powerfully. We're discovering now that certain chemotherapeutics, like cancer drugs, work better sometimes either morning versus night, depending on the drug and the type of cancer. So why would we be the least bit surprised that timing of our food wouldn't have this like really massive effect? And again, from the perspective of trying to keep things simple, here's this whole other layer of stuff. And somebody's like, geez, man, I just want to know what to eat, not the amounts and the timing. Like, this is really high level out there stuff, but it's,
but
people
not
take these,
really. It makes sense, right?
It does. But for somebody brand new to this, like it can be just like a fire hose of information. And do I? Well, I was super busy with the kids and I couldn't eat all day. And so I don't eat now when I get home. And so then they don't eat. They didn't eat their protein. Then they wake up in the middle of the night starving and eat the chocolate cake, And so it's that's where I'm just very protein centric in my recommendations for what folks should do.
And we see it, we've seen that for years, back on your subject when you introduced yourself and talked about circadian rhythm, we've seen it for years in shift workers, people that work night. And I mean, they can have huge issues with gaining weight. And I think, a lot of it is they might just be, bored eating at night when, whatever. But also, I think it's the timing of it too. I mean, I talk to our patients all the time that are having hormone type issues that, we are diurnal creatures. We are made to work during the day and sleep at night, period. And kudos goes out to all the shift workers and night workers out there. But when they start having health issues, and usually it's not till later, because I think when we're younger, we can adapt a little bit better.
Right.
But when they start having health issues and they're in their 40s or whatever, I tell them, it's like, you've got to change your job. You just can't work nights anymore, because it's just, we're not really made to work nights. And so we shouldn't be really that surprised about the eating at night correlation.
Yeah. And, we've done a lot of work with police, military, and fire, and the metabolic screening. And for the folks that have to be in shift work and are heading down that metabolically deranged path, the only tool that we have, by and large, we try to improve their sleep as best as we can. Dark rooms, cool environment, maybe taking a little bit of melatonin, all that type of stuff. But the only real good lever we have is a low carb diet, because those people, a sleep deprived individual can be as insulin resistant as a type 2 diabetic. And that will reverse with sleep. It will improve with exercise and whatnot. But for 6 or 8 hours of the day, that person is as insulin resistant as a type 2 diabetic. So if they eat a high carb diet, high carb meals, particularly highly refined carbs or liquid carbohydrates in the form of soda or something like that, metabolically, it's a disaster. Like you're setting up non-alcoholic fatty liver disease. You're getting all the visceral adiposity, which is highly inflammatory. And so for certain populations, the only tool that we have until and unless we can shift them out of that schedule is a low carb diet.
Yeah. And I will say, we preach it all the time on our podcast and to patients that there are really only 3 things that we can do to keep our bodies healthy. And that's diet, exercise, and sleep. And the most important, sleep.
Right.
And
right.
I tell them we will die without sleep before we'll die without food. Those are just facts. Yep. And then we don't have to live. We don't have to exercise to live.
Right.
We'll be healthier if we exercise, but we do not have, exercise does not keep us alive. So the most important thing, sleep. Yep. Rest and recovery. That's when we get stronger. That's when our body repairs, all that. So, question for you, Rob. Thank you for all this information. This has been great. So you are a proponent of electrolytes, and I have used LMNT electrolytes. And why in a primal environment, ancestrally eating, like we were talking about, why did we not need to supplement with electrolytes, and why should we now?
Yeah, it's a really good question, and I don't have a fantastic answer. It's speculative. So this one I would definitely file under the speculation category. Part of it is, so like I'm sipping on a cup of coffee right now. It's a big cup of coffee. It's close to 20 ounces. I think a lot of what we experience as kind of electrolyte inadequacy, and particularly hyponatremia, the low sodium, is because we just kind of overconsume liquids. And if you dig around in some of the anthropological literature, and it's hard to tell because so many of the groups that we encounter, the San, the Hadza, are in these very desertified marginalized environments. So it's hard to extrapolate, like, would this have applied to, Plains Indians or Native Americans living in like a riparian habitat, with trees and creeks and all this stuff. But there's kind of a reality, though, that rarely were people running around, like some sort of a skin bag with water in it. Yes, but people weren't just like sipping on it 24/7, which I think is a big part of the problem that we have. There were interesting potential sodium stores in the ancestral environment. As you will know, we tend to store more sodium outside the cell than inside the cell. And this is where our sodium potassium pumps really get going. And when an animal dies, or if an animal is killed in normal circumstances, the sodium potassium amounts will equilibrate. The potassium from inside cells will go outside the cell, and the sodium from outside the cell will go inside the cell, and they'll equilibrate. And the way that animals are killed and butchered in kind of the West, they are bled, so most of the sodium leaves the animal. So under current circumstances, about a kilogram, 2.2 pounds of meat provides about a gram of sodium for that amount of meat. Just back at the envelope math I've done would suggest that if an animal was allowed to, the electrolytes to equilibrate, on both sides of the cell membrane, we could easily double that, maybe even triple it. So I think that would be a source of, additional sodium. And then it does look like historically people have been attracted to salt plains, salt licks, and there almost certainly was some sort of an economy of moving salt from those sources, like the ocean or inland, seas that have salt plains. That was part of a trade mechanism, but for sure there was not the kind of element electrolyte in a sachet kind of deal. And one final piece of that, although our ancestors were clearly quite active, they were not doing the amounts of things that we do, ironically. So we are both more sedentary and more active than our most likely what our hunter-gatherer ancestors were. So me doing Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu 5 days a week, 2 hours each day, wearing a gi, and that gi being 5 to 8 pounds of sweat when I'm done, and maybe 5 to 8 grams of sodium lost. That would have, in ancestral terms, an individual maybe did that once a week, not 5 times a week, and people were active otherwise. But Shawn, you're a cyclist, and so your work output is arguably probably 2 or 3 times what hunter-gatherer type ancestral patterns would be, and that necessitates an electrolyte replacement that is probably 2 to 3 times what we would normally have. And then again, if you layer in some of the faulty recommendations that we've been given over the last 40 years, eat or consume 8 ounce glasses of water per day. And this was absolutely no science to back this. Even the big medical organizations are finally kind of like, okay, we don't know where that came from, and we don't really make this recommendation anymore. And it seems to be causing problems because of fostering that hyponatremia, the low blood sodium, which before we recorded, you commented that when you have adequate sodium, you kind of notice that you don't desire carbohydrates the same way. And an interesting thing that's going on there is if we are low sodium and we consume more carbohydrates, we will upregulate insulin, which upregulates aldosterone, which causes us to retain sodium. So increasing carbohydrate intake is kind of a slick way of actually retaining more of whatever sodium that we have in our environment. So I know there was a lot of different angles there, but I think it's kind of a multi-pronged answer. There's not really a simple answer to that simple question. Yeah.
Well, I love it all. And essentially, and I've always wondered this, essentially we're diluting our sodium stores when we drink water. And I will tell you, like, when you hear about triathletes, like Ironman triathletes, or even marathons, possibly marathons, I'm not really sure, because they're quite shorter, but you don't ever hear of I wouldn't say ever, but it is, people don't realize this, but a lot of times during triathlons, people that don't, during those Ironman, that don't know how to fuel properly, they will take water at every station. It's their first one. They'll take water at every station they get, and they ended up. I mean, they've been a few deaths because they have diluted their sodium stores so much because they really overhydrated, and I'm sure they were scared to get dehydrated because we're told drink because you're going to get dehydrated. And I think about when you talk about ancestors and primal eating, even 40 years ago when I was a kid, or, more than that, 45 years ago when I was an elementary kid, on weekends, we would leave in the morning and we wouldn't get home until for hours later. And they didn't have bottled water. They didn't have, we never had that stuff.
Right.
Because, and our daily conveniences, like you say, with the coffee, it's just easy to drink all the time now.
Right.
And so I could see that could partly be in the issue.
There's actually been a remarkable number of people that have died in military boot camps, football double days, and then like the triathlon, marathon type of deal from hyponatremia, from over consuming water, diluting their sodium. They get cerebral edema. It's actually an overabundance then of potassium relative to sodium, and the people can get very sick and can die, and many of them do. There is not a single documented incidence of somebody dying from dehydration within sport in like the last 100 years. The only time that people die from dehydration is if they're like lost in the desert, trapped in a mine cave in, they are just separated from water, then they do that. But things like fraternity and sorority hazing, where people consume huge amounts of fluid, whether it's alcohol or water, lots of deaths associated with that. So it is clearly more dangerous to over consume water than to under consume water, because when people legitimately start to get thirsty, they will do anything within their means to fix that problem. Right. So I guess, again, that's kind of a long roundabout thing where used to very, very long ago, well, I guess not that long ago, like, I'm going to be 50 here in a couple of days. The recommendation right as I was a kid and a little bit before me was take a salt tablet and kind of chew on that and then sip on water to satiety. And we never had people die at football. It was unheard of to have people die in military exercises and whatnot. But then, there were some studies that suggested that there's a performance decrease with dehydration and like some cognitive changes. And the replicatability of that is interesting, because most of the best endurance athletes, when they go across the finish line, they may be like 3 to 5% dehydrated. They may be 3 to 5% lighter due to water loss. And that may be that they're so good because they're able to still maintain their output while being dehydrated, or this is actually a natural adaptive state, which I would actually think is kind of the case, that these people get really good at being efficient, at being lighter and carrying less water weight, when push really comes to shove and you need to do a huge amount of work output. But again, super long answer to like, should you pee clear or not? I don't know that that's like the weather vane or the thing that I would use as the directional, influence on my fluid intake.
Well, I think being an endurance athlete myself, I think you really figure out how resilient the body is.
Mm-hmm.
And we don't need a lot of extra water. And I don't think we need to be dangerous and dehydrate ourselves, but we can go quite a bit without, fluids. I think it's important, your fueling strategy, but I know too, with food, you can go quite a bit without food too on longer endurance type stuff. Cause you can't eat enough to burn, you're burning 700 to 1,000 calories an hour. You can't eat that many calories an hour. So, your body is just resilient. And, the best endurance athletes, if they want to be fast, they want to time it as well as they can to hydrate themselves the least as possible to keep their weight the lowest and not have to stop to pee. I mean, that's really the case. So,
right.
So some great answers. And I know when I use the LMT electrolytes after my rides, which I've been doing for a few weeks now, I just, they're very high in sodium. It's true. I mean, it's a gram of sodium, and you can definitely taste that, and it's very refreshing. And then I just don't have carbohydrate cravings. It's really, I was really pleasantly surprised.
Yeah, it's interesting. Like we've seen folks, they put element into the Roundup, and like they've been tracking heart rate variability, and they will see their HRV score go up because it appears that their recovery is improving. And then you don't have to do element to get this. Like eating 10 olives provides a gram of sodium. Eating a large pickle or doing a swig of pickle juice provides a gram of sodium. It's remarkably difficult to get enough sodium to support a really legitimately active lifestyle. We've done some work with NFL teams, and they're reporting to us is that these large guys, they're 200, 210 pounds, but, maybe larger than that. These guys will lose 10 pounds of water in the course of a hard training session or game, and 10 grams of sodium. Wow. That's 20 grams of table salt, because the scoop of table salt is actually 60% chloride and only 40% sodium. So it's a stunning amount of salt that you need to put in. Yeah.
Right. So I'm going to, as we're getting wrapped up here, Rob, I appreciate your time. I'm going to quick fire some questions. So I have a twin brother who's a bodybuilder, and he wanted to know if there's any difference between if an ectomorph versus an endomorph versus a mesomorph should eat differently.
I mean, the mesomorph kind of has it easy. They're by implicit, we just know these people. They're kind of lean and muscular almost regardless of what they do. The ectomorph is usually kind of rail thin, and they seem to really benefit from the higher protein. And like if they're really wanting to gain muscle mass, they can't do much endurance activity. Like they have a tendency towards like an endurance phenotype, and so if they really want to gain muscle mass, like they can't be doing tons of treadmill work and running and conditioning at the same time. They may be able to do that later, but they've really got to gain the muscle mass first, which is going to necessitate higher protein, higher calories, and all that.
Right. That makes sense. So I think we kind of cleared this up a little bit, but a question on keto. Well, we didn't really clear this up. I know paleo, potatoes are okay on paleo, correct? I mean, maybe it depends on your ancestral potato or your ancestral eating.
Potatoes are in the nightshade category, and some people seem to be reactive to those. So it's one of those things that I would file as a bit of a suspect food. Like if folks are experiencing some systemic inflammatory issues and the potatoes are like a mainstay, then that would be I would just shift them to like sweet potatoes or yuca or cassava or something like that, and see how they do with these other things, and then reintroduce the potatoes.
So that's the reason for the sweet potatoes versus the regular potatoes, is because of the nightshade issue. So inflammation.
Primarily, yeah, because ironically, the sweet potatoes have much more fructose in them. So some people with some polymorphisms around non-alcoholic fatty liver disease do less well with sweet potatoes relative to just starch from like white rice and regular potatoes. So yeah.
I thank you for clearing that up, because you hear about the benefits of sweet potatoes, but then you look at versus regular potatoes, but then you look at the macronutrients or even micronutrients of it, and they're pretty close, except sweet potatoes have more sugar. I mean, more fructose. So that to me didn't make sense, except now if it's not a nightshade, that does make sense. So it's inflammation. So women that are over 40 eating keto or paleo, especially paleo, hormonal issues, over 40 women, should they eat paleo? Should they eat different?
They should certainly eat a high protein diet. I mean, it gets ever more important, and I think some iteration of paleo is great. I think folks overly complicate the like female hormone issue in the following way. Women are definitely more of a canary in the coal mine to stress. So if they are under eating protein, under consuming sodium. So like the inadequate sodium intake is a massive problem for women in general, and can get them pushed into like that female athlete triad kind of story, overreaching, overtraining. So the big things that I see there, the non-negotiables are adequate protein and adequate sodium. And then you kind of figure out, does this person run better on higher fat or higher carb or a combo? But the most successful keto fueled combat athletes that I've seen, like jujitsu and MMA, ironically, are women, and their hormones are fantastic. And again, it may be kind of a survivor bias or selection bias, but the thing that was interesting about the people that I've seen in this category, really on point with protein, really on point with getting adequate electrolytes, specifically sodium.
Yeah. Thanks for clearing that up. Now, on that topic of keto, and this is my question. And so as an endurance athlete, glycogen stores are very important. And I've always wondered, when eating, whether it's keto or just low carb, can we really deplete our glycogen stores completely? Now, I know obviously we can. When we exercise intensely, we're going to deplete our glycogen. But if you're in ketosis, or you're eating, mostly protein or mostly fat, you're not eating carbs, aren't our glycogen stores going to replace themselves, or do we really deplete our glycogen?
After about 30 days, a guy, Bill Lagakos, who's a PhD in biochemistry and really goes deep on this stuff, he hasn't done this research, but he's really good at finding it and kind of consolidating it. And once one is keto adapted, what they find is that muscle glycogen levels in the keto adapted are about the same as people that are eating higher carb diets. It's maybe a little bit less, but it's not shockingly less.
Right.
The thing there, though, is that I do think there are some central governor considerations, like the brain sensing how much energy we have and those sorts of things. And I do think that there's a reality that at some, like, put it this way, this might be helpful. If we were to, the way that a keto fueled athlete would really, really shine is if we said, you can't consume any water or any electrolytes or any food. How far can you go before you're done? And the keto fueled athlete is going to crush people. Right. They're going to have a modest pace. They're not going to go anaerobic. They're not going to get into that glycolytic pathway. Almost no sport allows you to stay 100% aerobic, like in that like zone 2 area. Right. Like if you're on a bike and you need to pass somebody, or you've got an uphill climb, you're going to go anaerobic, and you have to figure out how to deal with that. And what's interesting to me is that the muscle glycogen isn't low in these folks, but their performance oftentimes is decreased. I think one thing is sodium. Like if they really address sodium, it allows them to stay in the fight longer, because a low carb environment causes us to lose sodium due to the natriuresis of fasting. So people tend to notice that they get kind of a second gear when they are low carb and they get adequate sodium. And it really bridges the gap of what they've had when they were more carb fueled. And then also just doing targeted carbohydrate, some 15, 20 grams of carbs per hour in a drink, while they're keto fueled in general. And then even then that whole thing is interesting. Like if the individual is training with enough volume and enough intensity, they may end up consuming 100 or 200 grams of carbs a day, and they're still ketotic the whole time. So like a ketogenic diet becomes this, somewhat arbitrary thing. So there's a lot of moving parts there, but if the muscle glycogen is clearly important, but the adequate sodium, adequate electrolytes, and then being smart about not being inflexible. If you know that you've got some sort of a hill climb that you're going to do, then doing like a dextrose or a maltodextrin or something like that, and having it at a isotonic solution, so it's not a gut irritant and everything, then we know that folks are going to do better under those circumstances.
Well, thanks for clearing that up.
Yeah.
there's a big argument about that. And a lot of times people that argue it, they've never done an endurance sport. So like you said, the zones are important. Zone 2, sure. Zone 2, you can go all day long, zone 1, zone 2, but you start going anaerobic or, at lactic acid threshold or whatever, you're going to need carbs and even if you don't, I can tell you mentally, it makes you feel better. Even if it doesn't physically, it makes you feel better mentally.
Well, there's studies that have been done where they will run people to exhaustion on a treadmill and they'll just let them rinse their mouth with a sweet tasting solution. There's no calories in it at all. It's a non-nutritive sweetener, and they will get another 3 to 5% of performance out of the person because, again, the central governor of the brain is like, oh, we have some nutrition. We're okay. It's really interesting to me that so much of what governs performance, like our ability to contract a muscle, is protecting us from our own selves. And it's interesting from like a survival perspective, because you could make the case that we should be able to have some like override where we're in a fight for our life and we can exert superhuman strength, but no, we can't. And, if we're in a race for our life, maybe we should be able to override these central governor things and just be able to like burn ourselves down to a nub, but we can't. Like there are these things that come in and like we still have lots of calories on our body. But we reach exhaustion and we're done. And it may mean that we die. And to me, that's a fascinating evolutionary bit of wiring, that there's that much of a safety margin built into us, is interesting to me. I'm not totally sure what the implications are, but it's really fascinating.
Well, I mean, we really shouldn't be surprised. Our body just has a protective mechanism to protect itself. So,
right.
Like you're an endurance athlete, it's going to protect your heart. So it's going to tell you, I can't go anymore. My heart is like trying to bounce out of my chest. Right. Even though your heart could physically probably take more, your brain says, I'm done. I mean, you see it in short sprints and stuff all the time where you really have muscles left, but you just can't. Your body doesn't let you do it.
Right.
Because your brain doesn't let you do it, essentially.
Right.
So one last question, Rob, and we'll wrap up. So MSG and weight gain. Does MSG cause weight gain?
I mean, one might retain a little bit of water, but I'm so underwhelmed from I really don't think MSG is a problematic item for 99.9% of people. And the literature supports this. And I had the cool opportunity to live with a Cambodian family for the better part of a year when I lived in Southern California. And they had these, what looked like cocaine packs. It's these kilo-sized bags of white powder. And they just had like stacks of them back in the pantry. And they would put them in these soups and stews and curries and everything. And one day I asked my friend, I'm like, hey, what is that? And he grabbed the bag and I looked at it. I'm like, oh, MSG, son of a gun, But the literature on MSG I just can't find much of anything damning it. And it's a naturally occurring substance just when we make bone broths and whatnot. And there's maybe like for people that are histamine intolerant, maybe there's a problem, but like the whole like, Chinese food syndrome and all that, something else may be going on. I wouldn't be surprised if people are reacting to gluten in the food more than MSG, but yeah, I'm super underwhelmed with the boogeyman of MSG. Like it's just really unimpressive to me.
So as we wrap up, Rob, tell us, what do you have a passion for?
Oh man, right now it's mainly raising my kids and making sure my Italian wife doesn't stick me in a shallow grave too early. So that's about it. But I really like helping people. Like I love being of service. Like that's kind of my primary motivator for doing this stuff. So I'll keep doing it as long as I feel like I'm helping somebody somewhere. I definitely don't want to be like the 80s hair band that should have retired and shuffled along and did something else. But, and you know what, all that said, regenerative agriculture is actually a huge part of my life now. My third book, Sacred Cow, which I don't think we can, let's see here, maybe, no, wrong direction. I'm going the wrong direction all the way around. There it is. Sacred Cow right there. Yeah. That looks at the ethical, environmental, and health considerations of a meat-inclusive food system. So there's a lot of discussion around the idea that like animals and animal husbandry is the primary driver of climate change. And maybe that's not accurate. Maybe we haven't been given the accurate bill of goods on that. And so my good friend Diana Rogers and I spent the better part of 10 years working on Sacred Cow, the book, and also the film by the same title, kind of digging into that topic.
Awesome. I've not read the book yet, and I didn't know there was going to be a movie. So thank you for that. I definitely want to watch that and read the book. So that being said, Rob, if anybody has any questions or wants to get a hold of you, what's the best way to get a hold of you?
RobbWolf.com. That's where all roads lead to me via that. I have some social accounts, but I really don't go on them. It's broadcast only because social media is way too toxic to spend one's life on. And so if you want to track me down, go to RobbWolf.com, and I reply to damn near all inbound questions and comments and whatnot. So that's where to find me.
Awesome. I love it. Well, Rob, you are definitely, please don't stop now, because you are definitely still motivating people, inspiring people, and helping people. So you've got a long ways to go. So
well, thank you.
Yeah, you're welcome. Thank you so much for being on our show. I'd love to have you on again. There's a multitude of topics I'd love to have you on. I could talk for hours. We've went a little overtime, and I appreciate you being patient with us. So I appreciate it so much. And thank you so much, Rob, for coming on our podcast today.
Thanks, Shawn. Huge honor.
Yeah. So that wraps this podcast up. I thank you all for listening and tuning in to Health Solutions with Shawn and Janet Needham. So tune in every Monday at 12:30 to 1:30 Pacific Standard Time. Well, you'll learn everything about health and wellness, from sleep to hormones to exercise and diet. So tune in. You've been listening to Health Solutions with Shawn and Janet Needham.